or the potential lover, into the collective realm now of the God archetype. And he tells this dream, for example, of a woman that he was treating, and she had a dream that Jung, there was a condensation of Jung with her father, it was simultaneously her father, but it was also Jung, was standing holding her in a field of wheat, and a vast wind came and blew through the field, and the father was rocking her. And he said, that is the archetype of the wind god, the pneuma, the spiritus, the breath. And he says, now this patient's unconscious is making a projection onto me of an archetype from the collective unconscious, namely the God archetype. And he says, I began to wonder if it's the case that the unconscious is actually forming its own myths and is desiring to form its own personal mythologies, and that is what is behind all of this. And so the individuation process is the process of creatively forming one's own personal mythology. As Joseph Campbell used to say, myths are the collective dreams of a society, and dreams are the private, personal, individual myths. Yes?
That brings up the question with me, if one is living in a society where the myths are predominant and agreed upon, would one therefore not be creating one's own myths?
There would be a tendency, in India, for example, would be the classic situation of that, where that would be discouraged heavily. In India, for example, Campbell points out we should be careful with taking this as absolute, because in India there is no conception of the ego, really. The conception of I, ahang, making the sound I, is essentially the same as Freud's idea of the id, the principle of I want. I want this, I want that, what everybody wants, sex, food, clothing. There is no differentiation, however, of the ego insofar as, they don't ask you what you want in terms of rationally, critically, what you want for yourself. The student does not criticize the guru. The student accepts what the guru gives him. And we don't say, so-and-so wants chocolate ice cream, now we have to go out and get it for him. You are given chocolate ice cream, and that's what you get. There is no differentiation of what you as an individual want. And so that ahang principle is identified with the persona, which in India is called dharma, which is the performance of your social duty. Whatever caste you happen to be born into is what will condition your persona, your relationship to the outer world, and you are to indeed submerge and identify what little ego there is with the persona, so that your identity becomes your role. You are the priest. You are the woman who throws herself on the husband's funeral pyre. You are, and in performing that role, you are supporting the society. Dharma comes from the root dri, which means to support. There's a story that Joseph Campbell used to tell, a wonderful little story. The Ganges was flowing backwards, and the king comes out, and apparently there is something that you can perform, which is a tiny miracle, which is if you have performed your dharma so perfectly in your role in supporting society, you will have magic powers. And so he says, the king comes out and he says, isn't there anyone out here whose dharma is such that they can cause the river to flow back the way that it should be? Well, this this very old prostitute comes out, Bindumati, and she says, well, I have performed my role perfectly. I have not made distinction between castes when men have come to me. I have performed my service and done it faithfully. And so everybody says, well, for heaven's sake, get going. So she says her magic spell, the river runs back the way it's supposed to be. And the Western conclusion to this fable would be that she would be made, a chief of state or some ridiculous thing, but she just goes back to perform her role as a prostitute. She is fulfilling the society. You have identified with the dharma, the persona. And so to answer your question, it's absolutely discouraged in intensely traditional societies to dialogue with your own personal unconscious. The unconscious, the libido, and Jung says this, for example, he says, he always makes references to Catholicism. He says, Catholicism is really a wonderful religion because for devout Catholics, the system is filled with all this wonderful imagery and iconography into which the libido can flow. Functioning traditional mythological systems provide forms into which the libido flows, and so there's no need, really, for personal myth formation. But he says now that those systems have been disintegrating, we have a great need for psychologies of this kind that address now what's happening to each of us individually, because the society as a whole is losing that single overarching cathedral holding the whole thing together. And so yes, in traditional societies, it's really discouraged.
But it's interesting, you know, both the Catholic world and the Hindu world, it's not only discouraged to be an individual and have an ego of yourself, but also it's encouraged to be part of the whole system. And the words that are used and the imagery that is used really encourages you to just immerse yourself in that.
Yes.
Like, for instance, the word prasad means like grace, gift, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
So that then is the activation of the collective unconscious and the archetype of the self that begins to come up as the process moves along. And I want you to read for next time the chapter on individual dream symbolism in relation to alchemy that will give you a beautiful paradigm of how Jung shows in the studies of this person's dreams, and the person actually turns out to be, although he doesn't say it, turns out to be the physicist Wolfgang Pauli, who was a personal friend of his, who was an alcoholic and was having very difficult problems, but he doesn't get into any of the personal aspects. He just lists off Pauli's dreams, and he gives this little commentary on them, and he shows you over a vast period of time that large patterns are actually beginning to emerge, that the dreams are not just they're not just related to what happened that particular day. They have a larger paradigm working there. The individuation process, the dreams begin to look almost like those Arabic, what are they called, the arabesques, or the carpets, where the patterns are intricately interlaced. And so that he shows that the dreams are not just floating right along, but they're integrating and harmonizing your whole life. And that the central idea that he begins to apply to that and begins to pull up now is the mandala idea. And the mandala is simply any quadrated image. It's a fourfold image. And he picks up the term is Hindu, and he picks it up from Heinrich Zimmer's Artistic Form in Yoga and the Sacred Images of India, which was published in 1926, although Jung had spontaneously in 1916 begun drawing his own mandalas and had already encountered the concept. He said, I noticed that when my patients would draw these harmonious quadrated images, that it would seem to calm them. And because it's beginning to integrate the psyche, the four functions, and the transcendent function, the self, it begins to harmonize all the various disparate interests in your life that are being pulled in different directions. And your dreams will begin to produce over time mandala images, and particularly in proportion to an interesting paradox here, because if your life, mandala images tend to come up with the most force, Jung says, when your life is falling apart, so that it looks as though on the outer side of your life everything's going to hell, but the unconscious, in compensation for that, is striving to harmonize and produce order. And he says this is the key to the nature of artists. This is why, he says, their lives are so messy, normally, is because the art is itself being produced by the unconscious as a means of harmonizing and integrating the person's life. Gauguin, for example, his life got worse and worse and worse, and his art got better and better as he went along, and so forth. So, as you will see in that essay, the mandala images will start with little innocuous objects. Somebody will be wearing a round hat, for example, or will throw something against the wall and it turns into a little circle. And what that indicates is the presence of the self, that little nucleus at the core of the psyche that's beginning to bloom and manifest itself. And as you read the dreams as they go along, the whole thing moves toward this final epiphany of the astrological world clock. And he has this magnificent vision of the interpenetration of time and space as these two spheres, a horizontal sphere and a vertical sphere, and it's all mapped out like a gigantic world clock, and it's just an incredible vision. And Jung has that as the final main dream in there, and he says this is the gold really of the process of individuation. And then we'll begin to see how and what his theory has to do with alchemy and the production of gold. Because he says, and I want to get into alchemy next time, but he says, I was looking back through the history of Western tradition to find the closest analog I could find to my system. It was very important to me that my system be objectively verified in that sense so that it wouldn't be dismissed as a mere idiosyncrasy. And he said alchemy was the system that I found that most closely maps out and can be mapped onto point for point to my process of individuation. The mandala becomes the philosopher's stone. The core of it, the self, becomes the gold that is produced from out of base matter. The base matter, the base metals, are the dark black metals at the beginning of the process are the shadow, and the melting down of those metals corresponds to the disintegration of the personality as the process starts, and the unification of opposites, mercury and sulfur, are the opposites unified in alchemy, are personifications of the unification of conscious and unconscious, and the back and forth of these two. So eventually what happens in the individuation process, there's a kind of thesis, antithesis, synthesis movement. The waking consciousness has this attitude, the unconscious provides an antithetical attitude. Gradually the two attitudes are taken up and harmonized in uniting symbols, and the uniting symbol may be something like a hermaphrodite. In the alchemical systems, mercury and sulfur will very often be, sulfur will be personified as a king, mercury as a queen, and gradually the two will mate, have sex, the bodies will dissolve into the earth, and then the child that is born is actually bisexual, male and female, together, a hermaphrodite, and that springs up at the end as the conclusion of the whole process. And Jung says that's a perfect analog for what I'm talking about. That's the unification of the conscious and the unconscious through the myth formation of the symbols of the psyche who begin to communicate through this language. And so the whole thing is based on this back and forth dialectic of conscious, unconscious, and that dialectic and the resolution of that through the production of uniting images. And that's what mandalas do, is they gradually unite these various aspects of the psyche. And
John, too, when you were talking about the changing from feminine to masculine archetype.
yes.
It's like, to me, that would be like the fire, matriarch of society.
Right. Yes.
So the interesting, the new archetypes just develop out of this, because the whole incarnate is not about either masculine or feminine, it's about not being identified by one sex.
Yes. So that's mostly that's the long and the short. I thought this would take longer, but I went through it very quickly. So.
Can I go right back to the beginning? I still got a question.
Sure. Yeah. If we could